Today I want to talk about bootstrapping versus traditional business models. A common term being used by entrepreneurs these days is bootstrapping, and to me this is very important. So I believe the more people that would know about this term or method of running a business, the more people would actually take the leap and venture out on their own. It's that important to me. So what is bootstrapping, you might ask? Bootstrapping is a methodology that avoids borrowing money or seeking venture capital and instead uses revenue that's generated by the business itself to fund any capital investments that the business needs to make. Instead of starting a business by borrowing money, you use what resources you have available to you and find different and creative ways to overcome obstacles like equipment purchases or a brick and mortar physical location. For micro businesses, this method keeps risk low and money invested at a minimum so that your focus is able to be directed towards generating revenue. Simply put, if a move requires borrowing money to make it happen, it just doesn't happen. So going back into my backstory a little bit, while I was in college, I had one class that focused on starting your own business. Once we had the idea, then we were given a piece of software that generated a business plan where all the necessary data was plugged in, and bingo, a solid business plan came out the other end that had everything needed right there. So what I didn't know at the time was that the business plan wasn't really for me. And yeah, it did draw attention to several things that I wouldn't have known about before, but the business plan itself was to take to a loan officer or another provider of venture capital. You see, no matter how good or bulletproof the business plan was, it only mattered what someone was willing to give you money, what they thought of it. So the idea was that money needed to be in place to have all these things that someone once told you were required. You needed these things really before even thinking about producing or looking at who your customers were and what they wanted. You were now on the hook to someone else based on what they thought of your idea before you even made any money. Does anybody see a problem with that? So further down the line, I wanted to start a business that would not only generate extra money, but something that I could potentially grow into a main occupation should I lose my day job. I'd done side work for a number of years, but never really paid attention how much I was just making, that just being happy that I could make money was enough at the time. I did on-site service and repair to PCs, and at the time it wasn't very common to do so. Most times you brought it into a store, or if somebody came out to your house, then it was about $90 an hour for them to do that. So at the time this worked for me in the fact that being on site at somebody's house, I didn't have to bring work home with me, and this kept me motivated to finish the job there and to be done, just to achieve completion and then go on to the next one. I'd been doing this off and on for years. Even at one point I did this as a day job, so my technical skills were there and I knew what the comparative labor rate was and that I could undercut that by orders of magnitude. This plan seemed like a win-win at the time, but I slowly came to the realization that even at my discounted labor rate, the time that I spent performing the work, either I had to do one of two things. I had to put more time than it was worth into each repair job at a fixed fee and just eat the difference, or I had to be unethical and only do a few set of tasks on each machine for a flat fee and say, that's what you get for the price. Other people were doing this and I was never comfortable with that, but that slowly became the realization that that was the only way that I was going to make any money. Either way, I discovered that my hourly rate just really wasn't paying good on that model. So this ended up not being a failure in the sense that I went bankrupt or owed a lot of money to somebody that I couldn't pay. I just didn't generate enough revenue to account for my time and ended up making less than my day job paid in the end. So I decided to start from scratch with my creative process. I asked myself, what can I do that people will, number one, pay for, but number two, I don't have to buy a bunch of stuff to do it with. I can use what resources that I have laying around the house and generate revenue with it. So then it came to me. My dad had given me his own pressure washer and it had been sitting in the shed for a number of years, but hadn't run or hadn't really done anything with it. When I say it didn't run, the motor itself was actually fine, but the pump that takes water and generates pressure had blown off the front of it. He was literally putting the thing in the ditch and told me to come get it. He was done playing with it. He wasn't going to put another dime into it. So I said, maybe I can do something with it someday. And then the day came. So a suitable pump replacement cost me around $200. And then for another $50 or so, I had some business cards and vehicle magnets printed, and I was all set. So the first task that I undertook was to go into my own driveway and set a timer for about an hour. I wanted to know how much work that I could do within that hour. And at the very end of it, when the hour was up, I measured how much square footage that I had done. And so that way I could decide on a labor rate that I knew was competitive and work backwards from there. So I knew based on an hour worth of work, how much work I could get done, and I could use that data to then come up with an estimate that was both fair to the customer and to me. I already knew that the hourly rate in that area was competitive, so any jobs that I took ended up being fair for everyone involved. The great part about this venture was that I didn't have to borrow anything to start that business, and it generated the amount of revenue that I needed at the time. I later on took a job that required more of my time where I couldn't keep running the business, so I decided to shutter it and walk away a winner. So as a micro business, your initial investment could be as little as zero, but typically you're going to spend around $500 to $1,000 to get your feet wet and get it off the ground. Zero is highly unlikely because in most jurisdictions you're going to have to spend any set amount on business licenses. For me here, it's roughly about $150 for your first year for both the county and the city license, but that doesn't mean that I have to have a state license in my state. Again, check with your local revenue commissioner as to how much it'll cost to get going in your area. Since you haven't generated any revenue yet, the amount of money that you spend both on licensing and your initial equipment will be considered a personal investment in yourself. So this one you do have to take out of personal resource, put into your business account, and then go from there. So right now in early 2022 is a great time to start a business, and here's why. So something you may not be aware of is that demographically, baby boomers are set to retire by the middle of 2022, and at that point they will stop putting money into the system and start taking it out. Baby boomers themselves didn't have as many kids as their parents did, so there are fewer people putting money into banks and investments. The less money that a bank has, the less that it can lend out, and this is known as fractional reserve lending. What this also means is that traditional business borrowing will become a lot more difficult, and business plans will need to be much more solid going forward, and you'll have to pay much more interest on what you do borrow. So in the United States, this will be tough for about 20 to 30 years after rates start to go up in mid-2022. However, that's the good news. In some countries, it will be impossible as the birth rate didn't recover the same way that it did here. So in countries like South Korea and Japan, times will be a lot tougher than they will be here in the United States. One of the potential drawbacks to bootstrapping would be the tendency to fund your business from your personal finances when things are required. The temptation is great for this, and oftentimes you might convince yourself that just a little bit more investment will help you turn the corner, but you have to remember to stay disciplined and only spend what you put into that business account. You just have to stay that way until revenue becomes available, or you have to get creative in solutions. So consider maybe leasing something instead of a purchase, or borrowing something from a friend. Granted, you might still want to trade out with them. You might want to give them something of value, more like a barter system than this would be an outright borrower. But still, find a creative way to do this. A better approach can be found in the old adage, never mix business and pleasure. So for anyone starting a micro business, the first step, number one, is that you'll want to open a business account. This is a separate ledger or sandbox to keep division between the two worlds, if you will. So any revenue that comes into the business account goes there. Any money that you spend on the business comes out of there. If you don't have the money to buy something because it will leave you short on payroll, most importantly your paycheck, then it just doesn't take place. So you'll use this business account to pay yourself out of it because you are an employee of the business. So because you are an employee of this business, when you take the money out, don't forget to take taxes out on yourself as well. So a good rule of thumb of taking taxes out on yourself would be adding 25 to 30% of the amount of money that you pull out of that business account and transfer into your personal. So you'll take this 25 to 30% just as a rough guide and put it into a separate savings account, another checking account, or a mayonnaise jar, just something. Don't spend it or treat it as a reserve that you can tap into. You will have to pay the piper at some point. So what I've described here is basically bootstrapping in a nutshell. The advantage to this approach is that you don't have to spend all the time, in addition to the time that you're going to spend doing customer research, making a business plan, and all of those things to impress someone else. The time that you spent will only benefit your business. I say this because time is often your most scarce resource in a small business, and you're going to be better spending it generating revenue than you would impressing a lender. Saying all this doesn't mean that you should not have a business plan. You absolutely should document what your stated goal is and how you plan to get there. It should serve your aims instead of convincing someone else to lend you money. What I would like you to take away from the video is this. Starting a business is risky enough, but you can drastically reduce your risks by not borrowing large sums of money. The lower the risk, the less chance of failure, and even reducing the impact of any failures that you do experience yourself. So finally, much in the same way that there are fates worse than death, there are numbers worse than zero. Hey, I'd like to take a second just to say thank you for watching my video. Make sure you please like and subscribe, and when you get a moment, check out my website, CameliaStartup.com.